So here to help you see the big picture, let's welcome our first speaker here today. He has worked for the UN, he's worked for Goldman Sachs, and today he and his soon-to-be 10-year-old company helps CEOs navigate through this very complex intersection of geopolitics, policy, and markets. So, and you should know he speaks Danish just if you run into him at the coffee stand. Welcome, Nader Mousavizadeh.
If you're a global company or investor looking to navigate a world defined by a near-perfect storm of global challenges, a global pandemic, a U.S. China relationship in freefall, a U.S. presidential election of historic consequence, and a fracturing global economy, you need a different kind of advice.
Good morning, everyone, and really a great pleasure to be with you this morning. There's nothing, I think, at least, more beautiful than a balmy early summer day in Denmark. And so I'm particularly appreciative that you're all here rather than being out on your boats on Øresund or somewhere like that. Our theme today is navigating uncertainty. And what I'm going to try to do in the next 12 minutes that I have before we go to Philip and Jakob and then have our discussion is try to set out for you a little bit how I think we got here, what that tells us about where we're going, and then I'm going to try to leave you, and this is a bit of a challenge in our business given that we are in the business of assessing the intersection of politics, policy, and markets and how that impacts risk, but I'm going to try to leave you with a sense that there may be actually, in some really important areas of really significant impact to your businesses, more certainty than the environment today and a lot of the discussions we have might suggest. So when we think about navigating uncertainty, I think the key three themes that I'm going to try to touch on today from a macro perspective in the global business environment are obviously the U.S. China, obviously for Europe in particular, the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine last February, and what we certainly at our firm are working a lot on, which is what we consider the new age of industrial strategy. So I'll touch on those three in a moment, but really let me start with how I think we got here. And the world of fragmentation, which is, I think, pretty much the central characteristic of the environment you all find yourselves in, really, in our view, has three important dimensions to it. This world of fragmentation is not new, it is not cyclical, and it is not the end of globalization. Let me take each of those one by one. Why is it we think it is not new? There's a lot that we've seen, particularly since the end of the pandemic, particularly given U.S. China relations today, and of course the war, that has made a lot of us think of this world of fragmentation as somehow really having come upon us in the last 12, 18, 24 months. Our view has been, and you heard recently, or you just heard that we are, as a firm, 10 years old. We really started 10, 11, 12 years ago thinking that something fundamental was happening to globalization. That rather than being a one-way story of integration, it was becoming a story of fragmentation. That geopolitics and policy, increasingly with a much more diverse set of global players, and obviously the rise of China, was going to make the whole question of who sets the rules, where the flows go, and who is at the decision-making table much more complex. So fundamentally, what I would put to you is that this story of fragmentation that we're living today is not new, but really started 10, 11 years ago. It is also not new because what happened something more like 5, 6 years ago was that this starting to be more diverse globalization became fundamentally weaponized. What do I mean by that? I mean that if you think about the key flows of globalization that are central to all your businesses, the flows of people, the flows of capital, the flows of technology, IP, and ideas themselves, all rather than being seen as ways of still integrating markets, driving more investment, driving more trade, each of those rails of globalization became weaponized by a number of global powers, really starting with the United States, thinking that no, rather than thinking about financial markets and financial ties, or the flow of people and science and idea and tech and IP as a unlimited good to still integrate deeper, these could actually be used in a very different definition of how national entities would compete going forward. So what you had there was first, 10, 12 years ago, the beginning of fragmentation. 5, 6 years ago, this weaponization of globalization as we saw it. So that's why it's not new. Why is it not cyclical? Because this is a really important question for anyone running a global business. Is this moment we're in, this uncertainty, is it somehow cyclical? Can we imagine going back to the world in which most of us built our professional careers, that world of an assumption that free markets and free trade and open integration was basically accepted as the consensus globally? Well, why is it not cyclical? It's not cyclical fundamentally because what's driving this fragmentation is not a question of economics, but a question of politics, of geopolitics, of identity, and a rise of a China and a redefined United States role in the world that simply will not allow, in the definition that they each have set themselves about their future mission in the world, that return to the open, untrammeled, broadly speaking, free market-based globalization. So for that reason, it's not cyclical. Why is it not the end of globalization? There's a lot of talk, and you heard a little bit about it this morning in terms of the bleak outlook. We've read a lot about deglobalization or a globalization in reverse. Our view very strongly is that that's a mistake. It's a mistake because this is simply a different form of globalization. You know the headlines. In fact, last year had the highest number in terms of U.S. China trade. There's a lot of economic activity going on. All of you are running global businesses. You know that. It's a different kind of globalization, fundamentally, because in a world in which it is fragmenting, in a world in which the rails are weaponized, and in a world in which the U.S.-China relationship, which really is the umbrella structure for global capitalism and global trade today, is on the course that it's in, we are in a very different world. And the most clear, and certainly for Europe, punctuation of that very different world was, of course, the invasion of Ukraine last February 24th. What that did, and I'll speak a bit more about the prospects there, but what that did was fundamentally put a period at a period of globalization, what we basically regard as a 3-decade period, which was defined as a globalization with 3 key characteristics. It was a globalization which was integrating, it was a globalization which was free market-based, and it was a globalization which was deflationary. What we have now entered is what we believe is a structural, long-term, multi-decade period of globalization, which will not be integrating, but fragmenting, which will not be free market-based, but industrial strategy and interventions-based, and then, very importantly for all of your businesses, structurally inflationary. That is the new world that we're in, and one of the key reasons why this structurally inflationary environment we believe is with us is that as a consequence of the big supply shocks of the last few years, basically every advanced economy government in the world, including in Asia, is going to pay a number of long-term insurance premiums that we did not pay before. We're going to pay an insurance premium on global health and pandemic preparedness. No government today, because we know we will have another pandemic, cannot invest in that. We're going to pay, particularly in Europe, an insurance premium on energy, rotating out of the very advantageous from a cost perspective, very expensive from a dependency perspective, relationship with Russia and cheap Russian gas will cause, and has of course caused in the last 12, 18 months, and will going forward, an energy insurance premium that Europe, but also you now see all around the world, governments are now investing in. And finally, we're paying a defense insurance premium. What was one of the great characteristics of the 3-decade period of globalization that we went through is that most governments, certainly in the advanced world, were able to look at declining defense budgets, the United States being the exception, of course, in the West, but most others, and that's why you had all the debates about NATO investment, what you instead saw as a consequence of the war is a total consensus that we live in a much more dangerous world and that every government now has to pay this insurance premium. So that's where I would want to leave you with in the sense of how we have gotten to where we are. On the three key geopolitical questions, the U.S. China relationship, Russia, Ukraine, the war, and the outlook for Europe, and then this age of industrial strategy, let me highlight, I think, a few important structural elements about each of them. The U.S. China relationship had a most significant test at the end of the Trump administration. Why? Because you had 4 years of a highly erratic, highly protectionist, nationalist, chauvinist president of the United States, who, when most of the days of the week was attacking China, a couple of days of the week would say he actually would want to have a beautiful deal with Xi Jinping. The test of whether we were ever going to get back to the old China relationship was when President Biden became president. Instead of going back to the Obama era or the Clinton era or the George Bush era, what you saw was that an erratic, unstable, unpredictable anti-China policy became no less anti-China, but systematized, bureaucratized, and deeply alliance-based. And that is because the team around the president and President Biden himself absolutely believe that the most important mission for the United States over the next 50 years is to make sure that China's rise, as in the last 25 or 50, will happen within a US set of rules, norms, and standards. And it is all about maintaining that dominance, and that is what they are after, through the alliances in Asia and Europe. That's a definition of China not as a competitor, but as an adversary. And that is very importantly to the questions I know many of you have and many global CEOs have, which is where does this all end? All these tariffs, all these export restrictions, all these new to be announced in the next few weeks, restrictions on outbound investment into China, where is this all going to lead? Well, the answer is it is going to lead to what you see now. This is the steady state of US-China relations for the foreseeable future, if we are lucky. By which I mean, this is an intent on the part of the United States and its allies to compete much more aggressively with China, but keep it from escalating beyond the situation that we're in into armed conflict. On Russia, Ukraine, and I'm almost out of time, so I'll do this relatively quickly. Basically, I think the outlook we have is that we will have some kind of offensive starting in the next few days, which is unlikely to change the situation on the ground. And I will leave you with a headline, maybe we can get to it in the Q&A, that the ultimate resolution of the Russia-Ukraine war will be a US-China deal by the end of this year, which will put pressure on both sides to come to some kind of settlement. Finally, a word on industrial strategy. It cannot be overemphasized how much this will redesign, particularly in the West, the architecture of investment, of trade. And the most important shift, I would say to you, is with the implementation of the IRA in the United States. Now that Europe is going to try to compete with that, that is going to be the framework for businesses, for trade and investment. Again, this is a secular long-term shift. This is not cyclical. Industrial strategy is here today. The revolution in the United States around this is absolutely complete. 10 seconds on why I think this gives us actually more certainty. It gives us more certainty because the new US-China relationship is a structural change that you can actually plan against and invest against and strategize against. This intensified competition is here to stay, is not going away. Industrial strategy in the West, as in China, obviously, as in Europe, is here to stay. You can plan against it. And finally, the energy transition itself is also here to stay. It is going to be more of a transition than many want, but it is here to stay. And those are three broad macro themes, actually, that despite the title of uncertainty, are as certain as anything in this world. Thank you.